Last week, Moses, age 40, had just had his encounter with the Lord at the burning bush, and finally agreed to return to Egypt in order to lead the Israelites out of bondage and into the promised land. In this week's lectionary reading, Moses is 80 years old, so we're making quite a big jump. I'll fill in the gap a bit, and you can feast your eyes on some images taken from several cinematic productions of the life of Moses. Frankly, there isn't a great deal of outstanding painting or sculpture for this portion of the book of Exodus, so I'm turning to cinema to help you enter into the biblical scenes. Cecil B. DeMille did two versions of this subject. One, a silent film in 1923, which looks quite dated to us now, and an updated blockbuster version with Charlton Heston as Moses and Yul Brynner as Pharaoh in 1956. Here you see Heston as Moses, Yul Brynner as Pharaoh, and the two of them together. Ridley Scott also did a film about the Exodus in 2014, and it got terrible reviews from the critics. But some of the still photographs taken from it are well worth a look. In Scott's production, Moses is adopted by Pharaoh Seti I and has an adoptive brother, Ramses, who is his age and who will inherit the throne. Here, Pharaoh Seti I stands at the top of the stairs with his hands raised, and the two adoptive brothers descend the stairs. This is before Moses has killed an Egyptian and fled to Midian. While Moses is in the land of Midian, Seti I dies and Ramses comes to the throne. So Scott pits the two adoptive brothers against one another. But this is entirely fictional, as we don't know for sure which Pharaoh was on the throne at the time of the Exodus, and the Bible tells us nothing about Ramses being Moses' adoptive brother. But it does make for a good story. Moses returns to Egypt from Midian, the backside of the desert, and explains to his people what the Lord has told him, that he is to lead them out of Egypt into freedom. Then he and Aaron go to Pharaoh and ask his permission to lead the people into the wilderness, ostensibly for 3 days, to conduct a religious festival. Pharaoh angrily refuses, and then forces the Israelites into performing even more back-breaking labor. They still have to make the same amount of bricks as before, but he will no longer give them straw to hold the bricks together. They must gather that for themselves. Needless to say, the Israelites are not happy, and they turn on Moses, saying, "May the Lord look upon you and judge you. You have made us a stench to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Moses then confronts the Lord. "Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble upon this people, and you have not rescued this people at all." This cycle will occur again and again as Moses slowly learns to trust God. The Israelites won't like how things are going. They turn on Moses. They say it's all his fault. Then Moses turns to the Lord, who assures him that his plan for the deliverance of Israel is moving along right on course. And in fact, that deliverance is about to start with a series of plagues that will come upon the Egyptians, each announced by Moses to Pharaoh. Here are two cinematic versions of the first plague, when the Lord turns the waters of the Nile into blood. DeMille's version on the left, Ridley Scott's aerial shot on the right. But with each plague, Pharaoh's heart grows harder. After some of the most dramatic plagues, Pharaoh seems to yield and grants Moses permission to lead his people into the wilderness, only to revoke that permission when Moses brings that plague to an end. Surprisingly, there aren't many images of these plagues, but the images that follow will give you some idea of how they might have looked. First, a 17th century Dutch image of the Nile being turned to blood by Bartholomeus Breenberg. You can just make out that the Nile at Aaron's feet is starting to turn red. Pharaoh is dressed, improbably, in a heavy ermine-lined cape, and the scene takes place amongst Roman ruins, which would signify antiquity to the viewer at that time, if not necessarily Egyptian antiquity. But how would Breenberg, a Dutch painter in 1631, have any idea what Egypt looked like? So we can't be too hard on him. Here is Ridley Scott's take on the fourth plague, the plague of flies. And this is how he envisioned the seventh plague, which featured crashing thunder and hail, wiping out the crops. The seventh plague was also treated by J.M.W. Turner in 1800. Turner is very interesting. He was from a poor family, but displayed prodigious artistic talent from a very early age, and was admitted to study at the Royal Academy in London at age 14, and by 15 he was exhibiting his first work there. There he mastered all the classic techniques of drawing, painting, composition, color, the human nude, landscape, and architectural works. This picture from 1800 was his first formal submission to the Academy, to be judged by the Academy's criteria. It's a very large canvas, about 4 by 6, and therefore, according to the Academy rules, should depict an historic, mythological, or religious theme. And this is what he does. He shows us the tempestuous rain, hail, and the roiling, threatening clouds which bring the plague of thunder and hail on the Egyptians. In the foreground, we see animals lying dead as a result of the fifth plague, when horrible diseases killed off most of the Egyptian livestock. And in the middle distance, we see a pyramid shining brightly, surrounded by smaller buildings, and everything set in a large panoramic landscape. The subject was perfectly suited to Turner. He works in the romantic tradition of arousing the viewer's emotions and exhibiting the overwhelming power of nature, in which man seems to play so small a part. If we look at his later work, which was very popular even during his lifetime, you will see that his early work presages what is to come. Gradually, the narrative subject or pretext for the painting is left behind, and we have a painting simply called Snowstorm, Avalanche, Thunderstorm. The tiny humans in the lower right corner are completely at the mercy of the overwhelming power of nature, which is on full tempestuous display before their very eyes. You can easily understand why the Impressionists would be so influenced by Turner, with his special attention to light effects and immediate sensory impressions. The same is true of Snowstorm at Sea from 1842. It's just a fantastic display of swirling movement, a kind of maelstrom of water and wind, which seems on the verge of swallowing up the steamship it holds in its grip. But this was no imaginary scene, something Turner had dreamed up in the studio. Turner, then age 64, had had himself lashed to the ship's mast for 4 hours in the midst of this blizzard. Later, he admitted that he had not expected to survive, but as one modern-day critic put it, he had more than endured. He had triumphed, and the painting is one of his finest achievements. Here is a much calmer scene of nature, but it's even more daring in its diaphanous lighting effects, achieved by laying extremely thin layers of oil paint, one on top of the other. We can vaguely make out some cattle standing in this morning haze. We see the sun rising and reflecting on the water. with perhaps a castle and hills in the distance. But the painting itself is really all about light and color. It comes very close to abstraction. Turner, needless to say, was far ahead of his time. We might compare John Martin's version of the seventh plague to that of Turner. Turner's is certainly the more bleak of the two. The palette is darker. The foreground only shows us the wreckage of trees and dead animals, while Martin uses a brighter palette and leaves the elegant buildings of the foreground intact. The people have not yet felt the effects of violent nature bearing down on them. Moses and Aaron are clearly visible as the orchestrators of the scene unfolding in the sky. But Turner only suggests two sketchy figures in the lower right corner, and they serve only to blend into a scene of destruction and doom. So, the same subject matter, but two very different ways of approaching it. 2 years later, in 1802, Turner exhibited this scene of the 10th and final plague that swept through Egypt. The death of the firstborn of every living thing, from Pharaoh's firstborn son right down to the eldest male dog born in a litter. I wish I could have found a photo with better resolution, but even in this image, you can see the desolation of the figures in the foreground, especially the couple on the left, with a mother reaching out for a dead child, as the heavy, blood-tinged darkness rolls into Egypt, where it will soon envelop the sunlit portions of the city on the right. Since this was an entry into the Royal Academy show, and it was a large picture, almost 5 by 8, it had to meet the criteria of the time, which would not allow for simple landscape and a few unknown figures. You had to have architecture and a scene of some historical, mythological, or religious import. The only way I could tell that this scene is set in Egypt is by the column, perhaps an obelisk, that fills the upper left corner of the picture. It has would-be Egyptian hieroglyphics carved into it. Turner would stretch the criteria of the Academy as far as he could, and then he simply broke the rules. It is in many ways thanks to Turner that the genre of landscape painting came into its own and was no longer viewed as a minor art form together with the humble still life. After Turner, a huge canvas could be quite simply devoted to landscape and not even pretend to address an historic, mythological, or religious subject at all. It was this 10th plague, the death of all the firstborn of Egypt, that finally moved Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Our reading today in Exodus gives us God's instructions to the Israelites as to how they were to prepare in advance for the plague, so that they too would not be subject to the scourge. God intends these preparations to become a lasting ordinance for Israel, a celebration, but also a reenactment of the Passover event, to be repeated every year and relived by every Jew, lest they forget that they too were once slaves in a foreign land, and that it was only through the Lord's mighty hand that they were delivered. Again and again throughout Scripture, the Lord reminds his people to have mercy on those who are in any form of bondage or who live as aliens in the land, for the Israelites too had been slaves and aliens in Egypt. We who know Jesus Christ as the Passover Lamb, by whose blood we are saved, need to remind ourselves daily of this same message, to show mercy on those who are in bondage, and to extend a welcome to those who, through no fault of their own, are forced to live as strangers in a strange land. This is an image of an altarpiece from a town in southwestern Germany called St. Stephen's. It is by Father Sieger Koder, born in Germany in 1925. He had known life as a soldier, a prisoner of war, as an artist and art teacher, as a theologian, and finally, as a priest of the Catholic Church. What you are seeing is a closed view of the altarpiece he created for his home church. On the left panel is Abraham at the table with the 3 visitors standing above him, and Sarah down in the lower left corner, listening in on the conversation they are having. In the middle lower portion of the altarpiece are images of grain and grapes, which yield the bread and wine of our Christian sacraments. In fact, it's in a space behind these panels that the elements are stored, and congregants receive communion at the foot of this very altarpiece. On the right panel is a depiction of the Passover. As you can see, there is a full moon which is almost swallowed up by the blood-red sky, and there are 2 stylized pyramids rising up in dark silhouettes. Below them are the vague outlines of a town, and below the town is the angel of death, passing over the home where an Israelite family is safely gathered around the Passover meal. They're safe because, as you can see, they've spread the blood of a slaughtered lamb over their doorway. The angel sees it and spares the lives of those within. Not so fortunate is the figure in the lower right, hands covering her mouth, probably covering over a scream, as she stands outside of the door, outside of the salvific blood. Even after Pharaoh has experienced the loss of his firstborn, and all Egypt has sustained the loss of their firstborn male family members and livestock and fish and everything else, Pharaoh has yet another change of heart. What will Egypt do without all the free labor provided by the Hebrews? How will it survive? So Pharaoh sends out his army in hot pursuit of Moses and the Israelites. And it is in this mad pursuit that Egypt falls victim to the final judgment. Moses and the Israelites are miraculously allowed to pass through the Red Sea. But as the Egyptian army follows in pursuit, chariots, horses, and soldiers are swallowed up by the water. Ridley Scott's film captured this rather wonderfully. The tornado you see has been the pillar of cloud leading the Israelites to safety, but summoning the Egyptians to their doom. I'd like to end with something called the Passover Song by Urban Doxology. I've included the lyrics so that you can follow along. Also, a personal note, I'll be taking a break for a couple of weeks as the Old Testament readings for the next few weeks have not inspired great works of art. But I will be back, so be looking for the return of the art of the matter in just a few weeks' time.
On my mind looks back to the last great night when my God searched for the light. When he saw the red resting on the coast, and my God passed over us. Can you hear the children sing to the mighty King of Kings? They said, I am covered, I am covered. Oh my God passed over me. I'm alive today, my sins erased, for the blood has covered me. We prepared to march out of Pharaoh's reach. Oh, we dressed in aid and haste. When the hour came, God delivered us. Then we were no longer slaves. Can you hear the children sing to the mighty King of Kings? They said, I am covered, I am covered. For my God passed over me. I'm alive today, my sins erased, for the blood has covered me. when the Christ died for the world. He became the Lamb, perfect sacrifice, freeing every boy and girl. Can you hear the nations sing to the mighty King of Kings? They said, I am covered, I am covered, for my God passed over me. I'm alive today, my sins erased, for the blood has covered me. They said, I am covered, I am covered, for my God passed over me. I'm alive today, my sins erased, for the blood has covered me. Salvation, salvation, Jesus bled and died for me. I'm alive today, my sins erased, for the blood has covered me. For the blood has covered me. For the blood has covered me.